What if the most powerful nation on Earth went to war and didn't know how to end it? Right now, American warships are moving toward the Persian Gulf. Thousands of troops are being deployed. Bombs are falling on Tehran. And yet, the President of the United States is standing in the Oval Office telling the world that Iran wants a deal. But Iran says there is no deal. No talks. Nothing. So who is telling the truth? And more importantly, what happens if nobody is? Tonight, we pull back the curtain on one of the most dangerous and confusing wars America has ever entered. Stay with us, because this story affects every single one of us. Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm bringing you a full breakdown of the rapidly escalating US-Iran conflict, a war wrapped in contradictions, mixed messages, and dangerous miscalculations. From the Oval Office to the Strait of Hormuz, from the streets of Tehran to the deck of a US warship sailing from Japan, we are covering it all right now in 10 parts. Let's get into it. Red Circle. Trump's Oval Office claims negotiations are happening right now. President Donald Trump, speaking directly from the Oval Office, made a series of sweeping and dramatic claims about the current state of the US-Iran conflict that immediately sent shockwaves through the international diplomatic community. Trump declared with characteristic confidence that negotiations with Iran were not just possible, they were, in his words, already happening right now. He insisted that the Iranian government had reached out to the United States, desperate for a deal, and that those conversations were actively underway at the highest levels. Even more strikingly, Trump claimed that Iran had formally agreed to permanently abandon its nuclear weapons program, a concession that, if true, would represent one of the most significant diplomatic breakthroughs in decades of Middle Eastern geopolitics. He described the Iranians as badly beaten, their military infrastructure destroyed, and their leadership desperate. However, Trump provided no supporting evidence, named no specific negotiators, and offered no timeline for when any formal agreement might be reached. His words were bold, definitive, and entirely unverified by any independent source on the ground. Red Circle. Iran fires back. There are no talks happening. Just one day before Trump's confident Oval Office declaration, Iranian officials issued a direct and unambiguous public denial, stating clearly that no diplomatic conversations of any kind were taking place between Tehran and Washington. Iran's foreign ministry flatly rejected the narrative that their government had initiated contact with the United States, or expressed any interest in negotiating under the current conditions of active military bombardment. This stunning contradiction between the two governments placed the international community in a deeply uncomfortable position, forced to choose between two completely opposing versions of reality, being presented simultaneously by the two central parties of an active and deadly war. Iranian officials went even further, warning that the Islamic Republic had not collapsed, had not surrendered, and had no intention of doing so under military pressure. Far from being on the ropes, Iranian leadership characterized their position as one of resilience and strategic resistance. The government continued its military operations, striking U.S. allies across the region and maintaining its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, actions that directly contradicted Trump's portrayal of a defeated and desperate Iranian regime, begging for diplomatic salvation from Washington. Red Circle. The Strait of Hormuz, Iran's most powerful weapon. While politicians trade words in press conferences and Oval Offices, Iran has deployed what may be its single most devastating strategic weapon in this conflict, and it requires no missile, no drone, and no soldier to operate. Iran has effectively blocked the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow and critically vital waterway that serves as the only exit point from the Persian Gulf into the broader global ocean shipping network. This single choke point carries an estimated 20% of the entire world's oil and gas supplies on any given day. By closing it, Iran has not merely struck a military target, it has struck the global economy directly in its most vulnerable pressure point. Energy markets worldwide have responded with alarm, with oil prices surging and supply chains tightening across Europe, Asia, and North America. President Trump had previously threatened to destroy Iran's entire power grid if the strait was not reopened, a threat that international legal experts warned could constitute a war crime under established international humanitarian law. However, Trump walked back that threat, now claiming Iran is offering significant concessions. Whether those concessions are real or imaginary remains the defining unanswered question of this entire conflict. Red Circle. U.S. military buildup. warships and paratroopers moving in. Regardless of what President Trump says publicly about negotiations and deals, the United States military is telling a very different story through its actions on the water and in the air. The USS Tripoli, a powerful amphibious assault vessel, is currently sailing from its base in Japan toward the Persian Gulf, leading the first of 2 U.S. Marine expeditionary units being repositioned into the region. A second amphibious force has begun its own long journey from the coast of California, adding significant additional combat power to American forces already operating in and around the Middle East theater. Beyond these naval deployments, U.S. media reports indicate that the Pentagon is preparing to deploy troops from the elite 82nd Airborne Division, one of America's most battle-hardened and rapidly deployable military units, to the region as well. These are not defensive repositioning moves. Expeditionary units of this configuration, equipped with their own helicopters, strike aircraft, and amphibious landing capabilities, are designed and trained for one primary purpose: putting boots on the ground. The gap between Trump's diplomatic rhetoric and his military's operational posture could not be more stark or more telling to military analysts watching this situation unfold globally. Red circle the nuclear question. Did Iran really agree to disarm? At the center of President Trump's Oval Office claims lies one assertion that carries more weight than any other: his statement that Iran has agreed to never develop a nuclear weapon. This claim deserves serious and careful scrutiny, because the nuclear question has been one of the primary justifications offered by both the United States and Israel for launching military strikes against Iran in the first place. Both governments argued publicly that Iran was dangerously close to successfully building a nuclear weapon, making preemptive military action necessary and justified. However, Iran's official government position has consistently and repeatedly been that it does not seek to build nuclear weapons, a position it has maintained for years through international forums and treaty obligations. Israel has never accepted that position at face value, continuing to insist that Iran's nuclear ambitions pose an existential threat. Now Trump appears willing to accept Iran's long-standing denial as a fresh concession, raising the deeply uncomfortable question of whether the nuclear threat was ever as imminent as both governments claimed when they launched this war, and whether thousands of civilian deaths were the price paid for a problem that diplomatic engagement might have resolved far earlier. Red circle Bahrain struck. The regional war of attrition deepens. Any notion that this conflict remains a contained bilateral exchange between the United States and Iran was shattered this week when Bahrain experienced one of the single deadliest and most destructive days it has suffered since the war began. An Iranian missile struck a military base inside Bahrain, causing significant damage and sending a clear and unmistakable message to every government in the Gulf region that no American ally is beyond the reach of Iranian retaliation. This is precisely the strategic logic that Iran's military and political leadership has been executing throughout this conflict. Rather than attempting to match American and Israeli firepower directly, which would be militarily suicidal, Iran is instead methodically targeting the network of U.S. allies, bases, and partners spread across the broader Middle East and Gulf region. By doing so, Iran is transforming what the United States hoped would be a swift and decisive military campaign into a prolonged, costly, and politically exhausting regional war of attrition. Each missile that lands on an American ally raises the political cost of the war for Washington, strains diplomatic relationships, and forces the Trump administration to confront the growing gap between the quick victory it promised and the grinding multi-front conflict it is now managing with no clear end in sight. Red circle no exit strategy. How America walked into another Middle East trap. Perhaps the most alarming analysis to emerge from this conflict comes not from Iran's government or from opposition critics, but from military and foreign policy experts who are watching the situation with deepening concern. The core problem, as BBC International editor Jeremy Bowen articulated with devastating clarity, is that the Trump administration launched this war without a clearly defined military objective and without a coherent exit strategy to guide its conclusion. History has shown repeatedly and painfully that the United States military is extraordinarily capable of winning the opening phase of any Middle Eastern conflict. Destroying air defenses, sinking naval vessels, eliminating communications infrastructure. These are tasks American forces can accomplish with overwhelming speed and efficiency. What America has consistently and catastrophically struggled with is the phase that comes after initial military dominance: the political, diplomatic and strategic challenge of translating battlefield success into lasting stability and an acceptable political outcome. Iran appears acutely aware of this pattern and is deliberately exploiting it, absorbing the initial military blows, sustaining its governmental structure, and patiently working to turn the conflict into precisely the kind of long, costly, reputation-damaging quagmire that has defined America's most painful military experiences across the modern Middle East. Red Circle Lebanon and Hezbollah, Israel opens a second front. As if the direct U.S.-Iran conflict were not complex and dangerous enough on its own, Israel has simultaneously intensified a major military offensive against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, opening what is effectively a second major front in what is rapidly becoming a wider regional war. Israeli forces have been conducting sustained and intensive strikes across southern Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah infrastructure, weapons depots, command positions, and, according to Lebanese health authorities, killing significant numbers of civilians in the process. Israel has stated unambiguously that it has no intention of stopping its operations against Hezbollah, which it views as Iran's most capable and dangerous regional proxy force. From Israel's perspective, this war represents a historic and potentially unrepeatable opportunity to permanently destroy Hezbollah as a military organization and eliminate the most serious conventional military threat on its northern border. However, the simultaneous prosecution of intense military campaigns in both Iran and Lebanon is stretching the regional conflict to extraordinary dimensions. The city of Tyre in southern Lebanon has been among the locations hit in recent Israeli operations, with footage showing widespread destruction in civilian areas and raising mounting international concern about proportionality and compliance with international humanitarian law. Red Circle voices from Tehran: Iranians don't believe a deal is coming. While diplomats and politicians debate and contradict each other in the polished corridors of power, the people actually living through this war in Iran have their own deeply felt and sobering perspectives, and what they are telling journalists paints a picture that is far darker and more complicated than anything coming out of the Oval Office. BBC Persian correspondents speaking with ordinary Iranians on the ground found a population that is skeptical, resilient, and deeply distrustful of the idea that any quick or genuine diplomatic resolution is approaching. One Iranian citizen, speaking candidly, made the pointed observation that neither side has actually achieved what it set out to accomplish through this war. The United States and Israel wanted rapid regime change and the collapse of the Islamic Republic. That has not happened. Iran's governmental and ideological structure remains intact and functioning. Another voice expressed the belief that Trump is not genuinely pursuing a deal at all, but rather buying political time while preparing for the next phase of military escalation, potentially including a ground invasion of Iranian territory. These are not the voices of defeated people, but the voices of a under-pressure people. Red Circle: what happens next? Crossroads between deal and catastrophe. The world now stands at what may be one of the most consequential and dangerous crossroads in recent geopolitical history. On one path lies the possibility, however fragile and unverified, that genuine diplomatic negotiations could begin, producing a deal that halts the fighting, reopens the Strait of Hormuz, addresses the nuclear question, and begins the long and painful process of regional de-escalation. On the other path lies something far darker: a full-scale military escalation involving American ground troops, expanded Israeli operations, a wider Gulf War pulling in Saudi Arabia and other regional powers, and a global economic shock driven by prolonged disruption to the world's oil and gas supply chains. Military analysts and foreign policy experts are genuinely divided on which outcome is more likely. What they broadly agree on is that the window for diplomatic resolution is narrow, closing rapidly, and deeply dependent on decisions being made by leaders, particularly President Trump, who have demonstrated a troubling willingness to act impulsively, contradict themselves publicly, and commit to military actions without fully thinking through the consequences. Iran's nuclear plant has now been struck. American warships are sailing closer. Paratroopers are on standby. The next move will define everything. So here is where we stand tonight. The United States is fighting a war it cannot cleanly win, against an enemy it cannot easily break, with an exit strategy it has not fully formed. Trump says there's a deal. Iran says there isn't. American warships are moving. Missiles are still falling. And 20% of the world's oil supply hangs in the balance at a narrow strip of water in the Persian Gulf. This is not a crisis at the edges of the world. This is a crisis at the center of it. The decisions made in the coming days and weeks will echo for generations. Stay informed. Stay engaged. Because what happens next affects all of us everywhere. Thank you so much for watching. If this breakdown helped you understand what's really happening in the Middle East, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe so you never miss our coverage. We bring you the real story. No spin, no agenda. Just the truth as clearly as we can tell it. I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe.